The House of Mystery presents Inside Writing, the radio show where authors discuss their writing process in all genres.
Welcome back into the House of Mystery, and I am Al Warren. Joining me as co-host today, we've got Mr. Joe Goldberg. How's it going, Joe?
Doing fantastic. Thank you very much for asking.
Okay, now today, speaking of publishing and self-publishing, a person that's got a lot of books out. I mean, wow. Makes me look like an amateur here. I mean, and so Mr. Robert W. Walker, thank you for being on the show.
Appreciate your having me on.
So, Robert, now how did you get into this life? I mean, this is a major life. I mean, you've done so many books, way more than the average writer or Joe out there, and you're really a working author. Like, you're doing this as a real business, which a lot of people don't do, whether they have publisher or not. But is this something you saw for yourself when you were a little kid? Did you kind of look at yourself at 6 and kind of go, yeah, this is what I'm going to do? Or how did this happen?
My high school years, sophomore years, I started writing my first book, Daniel Webster Jackson and the Wrong Way Railway, inspired by Mark Twain. And my senior year, I finished it, and my homeroom teacher, Miss Page, God bless her, she got it into the hands of a counselor at Northwestern University. And since I got that far, I thought, well, maybe I can make a living of it. And I became a teacher with a teaching degree, so I'd have some time off to write. And my first books were young adult historicals. And I thought that would be me, but there was no money in it. So I transferred to writing horror and mystery, suspense, thrillers. And, I started getting contracts for unwritten books, Oh my God, where do I start? It's scary because you have unwritten books for contracted for 4 books. I still can't live off that. So I continued teaching, keep my day job. And I enjoyed teaching.
I've had that where I've had a 4-book contract, and I felt an awful lot of pressure. It's good to get it, but you're right. It's not like you're making money that you can retire, but there's also time limits. And so I found it to be like that whole time I was doing that, I felt very under stress.
They dole out the money very, very carefully.
Yeah.
2% here, 4% there. By how much you finished the book.
Yeah, I found it a very rough process, especially because I wasn't real experienced either. So I felt a great deal of pressure. So now you've kind of gone on the self-publishing route, haven't you? You've kind of jumped off the publishing network sort of thing. Now, so that's a hard thing in itself, because not only are you the writing and editing and getting everything together, you're choosing your covers, your titles, everything, and then you also have to get it marketed in some way. You got to get out there and talk to people and get out and do book signings. You got to do all that stuff, and you have nobody there as support. Do you find that even more challenging now, or what's the big
book signings are kind of hard with ebooks? Actually, you can't do much in the way of book signings.
Yeah.
My first 40 books I did with New York, they weren't doing much for me. I got a lot of encouragement from a writer friend, Joe Conrad, since I had so many books, 40 books at that point, to get on the ebooks. And he thought I would do very well on ebooks. So I looked into it and decided to make the switch and start doing self-publishing. Yeah, the hardest part is marketing and getting the word out that you've got a new book coming out. I was fortunate, though, that I had readers already. They look forward to the next title in the series. Doing series work is how I came up with so many books now. I'm at 88. You do a series and you do the first book, and the next book it comes a lot easier because you've got an ensemble of characters and you just throw more mud at them. You've got a villain in the first book. You got to have a worse villain in the second book, third book, fourth book, sometimes 2 villains.
Well, Robert, that's my question. You write a lot of series. You've written a lot of books. How do you plan out a series? Do you know where you're going by book? Heck, some of your series have about 8 more books to it. So How do you plan it out? You just kind of go in.
One of these by your seat writers, I know I kind of just write that first chapter. I kind of have a vague idea of what the villain is. Sometimes if you read the first chapter, you don't get any further than that because it's so bad. If I start with the villain,
You start with the villain.
I'm surprised that this guy's editing my book right now. And I'm saying, well, I'm glad you got through the first chapter because it gets pretty gruesome with the types of serial killers I use. And I've got a book called The Beast Within, and it's written by, coincidentally, Benjamin Walker. And I just found it in a library cell. And it has all the body parts and what all the years of contemplation that people have had about the nose, the ears. As long as I've got body parts, I can use that book for research, and I can write another serial killer title. Before I did the series of titles of body part titles, it's like my instinct series, my edge series. Before I got into research, was a little hard getting into the mind of the killers. But having grown up in Chicago, it wasn't that hard.
So I'm outside Chicago, so I'm safe, right?
I was born in Mississippi, the most illiterate state in the Union, the most poverty there in the Union. My dad moved us up to Chicago looking for work. He was a World War II vet. But growing up in Chicago was quite a difference from growing up in the old South. I figure if I grew up in Mississippi, all I'd be interested in is fishing and hunting. I wouldn't have probably pursued writing. Chicago's full of great history of writers. Mark Twain, I just got so fascinated with him. I wanted to do a book where I actually sounded like him. So imitating Twain, I was just going to see if I could do it for a paragraph or a chapter, and then it just took off from there. And I got a book from that, and I had fun with it. And if you're having fun with it, you might as well stick with it. So I continued on to other young adult historicals. So surrounding historical moments like the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, pre-Civil War, Vikings arriving on the planet,
Well, that's what I found interesting, Robert, because I find how would you characterize what you write? Because you said gore. That's a lot of comments, and that seems to be sort of the thing. How do you see
realistic horror? Real horror, because it's real. It's happening. It's in the newspaper. It's not something that's just made up. Horror. I do horror books too, and I find it a little easier to work with monsters than humans, if that makes sense.
Well, sometimes they're the same thing, or many times they
monsters are kind of fun. Creatures like vampires, werewolves. I've got a series called the Bloodscream series. And in the Bloodscream series, I do vampires, werewolves, and then I create some monsters of my own. And they're a little more fun to work with, easier on your own nerves. Because dealing with serial killers, kind of like looking into a real pit. I don't know how medical examiners do it. Sometimes I'm at a book signing or something. People think I'm a medical. They've read some of my books. So they think I'm in the medical field.
Yeah, I don't know. How could someone write about true crime and serial killers? I don't know. They're probably a little
a couple times I wanted to quit doing that. That's why I do a books intermediary between those serial killer books. I will do the young adult books or historical. Sometimes between those books, I'll do something a little easier. So I got to get away from the abyss of the human evil of humans.
Did you find getting into your character, it must be a different process then when you're writing about like your instinct series. It must be way different than doing something like a young adult or something. So how do you set yourself up for that character, or do you plan on a person? It's
very much like actors who get into a role. When you create the character, it really mindset. If it's almost like you smell their smell. Kind of work toward the sixth sense, especially your main character. I challenge myself to do female characters a great deal. Instinct series, the main characters, a female medical examiner, and it's a real challenge. But when I get a fan letter from somebody that couldn't have children, and she can't have children, I really reached that real life person, that really hits you. So I think it's a matter of being an actor, writer, and taking on the role of that character. And then when the opposite character is the villain, you have to take on that role. Somehow I'm very good at that. I'm a good guy. But,
when you write, are you doing plot in your head first, or characters? Are they too intertwined to be able to separate them as you're...
The longer I've written, the more I've become a character-driven writer. Earlier I was more plot-driven, but now I think the character-driven is more fascinating, more interesting, more complex. But I kind of need to marry a plot with a character. They're not so separated as the textbooks say. As a matter of fact, the textbooks, they have a chapter on plot and a separate chapter on this, that, and the other, when in fact you have to entwine it all. It all has to be connected, The glove that fits the plot, that fits the character.
You're right. I was going to say, first of all, that you do have to marry them, because even your killer, even the evil person, you want to develop them, and part of that is going through some sort of change, some sort of thing happens. Otherwise, it's not as interesting, like you're going through some sort of change.
You want the villain to have as much importance in the story as your hero. And the hero has to stand up to the villain, rise up, be developed as well as the villain, and the villain has to be developed as well as the hero. I think Marvel Comics do that.
Very well. They still do.
Tired of the movies making so much of the hero, the hero. You don't get any of the sad part of the toady creature that sits alone in his sad self. I've got one character that paints his light bulbs with the blood of his victims so that he can get the aroma of what he's done.
When you're doing this story about a character or whatever's going on, are you the person that sees the character, feels them, smells them, hears them? Like, what's your personal experience with your characters?
Try to triangulate every scene. So if it's a scene with a villain, you triangulate the emotions, try to use them all. And if you can get to that sixth sense, boy, that's marvelous. Whether it's the hero or the villain, the sixth sense is that religious sense, the sense of five senses. You raise up the character using the five senses, triangulating as much as you can in a given scene. What he's hearing, listening to, what he's seeing. He might have the radio on or jukebox. What he smells, even down to a character feeling like the city of Chicago is his. It's his environment. I write some historical novels too. My city series with Ransom, and he's the detective in 1893 during the World's Fair. And that series is like
a new one, right?
That series is like one of my favorites. I've carried on with ebooks. I've carried that series. The publisher ended it after 3 unsellable titles. That's one reason I got into ebooks. I didn't want to leave this character behind. So ebook, I can carry it on. And I've carried it on to 4 more books. And he's on the Titanic by the end. You know what that means. I put a monster on the Titanic. Kind of like everything I do. I put a monster on the Titanic, creature, changeling creature. And our hero has chased him to that point.
When you take particular historical events and you're writing these characters around them, what is it that helps you choose which events?
My young adult books, they're always chosen around a historical point, like the Revolutionary War. With a problem that they've got to solve, a goal that they've got to reach. But they're always 14 years old. It's a kid, young kid. How did Washington get his cannons? Because he's sitting outside of Boston, and he's got one pea shooter. So these guys go up to Fort Ticonderoga, and the 14-year-old kid, who's a carpenter, they have to float these things over rivers. There's no road to go through, So they have to cut roads, and so the effort of getting those cannons intact from Fort Ticonderoga, which was held by the British by the time, It was taken without a single shot. So that's the interesting historical stuff, you know. And they had to cross frozen rivers with these heavy cannons. And they do eventually get them to Washington. That is George Washington. And this kid is all involved in it, you know, 14 years old.
Is there a lesson learned in that you want the reader to get out of that particular book?
I don't hit him over the head with it, you know. It's pick it up along the way. You know, a 14-year-old kid reading the book can imagine himself in that role, or a 12-year-old, actually it's for 12 and up. Grandpas can read it to their kids. That book is titled Ben Cross and the Guns of Ticonderoga. So I put it on ebook because I couldn't find a publisher for it, because those books are, at this point, really hard to sell to the hardcover or paperback publishers. So I moved into ebooks 2000, I think it was. And since then I was able to, you know, do some things you can't do with normal publishing, like publish 3 books in a year. I would not be able to do that with additional publishers.
Have you ever thought of just slowing down and writing the great American novel? Saying, okay, I've done 80 novels now it's time for my To Kill a Mockingbird moment.
I gave up on that sometime back.
You gave up?
Yeah. Go for what I think is sell. I was, my original goal was to write as much books as my age. And at 72, I caught up to my age. And now what am I going to do now? Well, my new goal is to make it to 100 books.
Yeah, exactly.
I've got all these series that I can always write another book on because I know what the characters are. I know who the characters are. I don't have to develop the characters anymore. I can just throw stones at them.
And your plots are taken from current events many times or historical events?
Yeah, many times it's historical events. I do a lot of reading, also in medical field. Anything really curious, and a curious story I find in a newspaper would spark a story. You know, like I saw a story about these kids in elite school in Hawaii. You know, they got it made, but they snuck out of their school and killed all these birds that were in a bird sanctuary for no good reason. So I thought, boy, that'd make a great short story, though, if we got revenge on those kids. So I wrote that as a short story. Not going to be long enough for, I mean, it wouldn't support a novel. I do a lot of short stories. I've got a couple of short story books up on Kindle.
How much research do you take to go into this?
I do a lot of research. I think I said earlier at book signings, people ask me if I'm a detective or if I'm a medical examiner. I'm neither one. I just do a lot of research. I watch a lot of medical examiner shows. I get every book ever written by a medical examiner. I read from cover to cover, do a lot of reading to get my ideas together, and I'll stumble on something in the reading that I think, wow, that would make a good short story or make a good novel. It's like when I was a kid, I learned very early, working on my first book I wrote in high school. I realized I didn't know enough because I was about 30 pages in, and I didn't know enough about the Underground Railroad, which was the impetus for the whole book. So I stopped writing and started reading about the Underground Railroad, and that's been a lesson all my life.
Exactly. Do you travel at all for your research, or is it pretty much on the internet?
I can, or when I can. I've been in Hawaii. One of my books is set in Hawaii, and it was like a year of writing the book, and I felt like I was still in Hawaii because I brought so many things, so many books and maps, and even books about the flora and fauna. I set up a map room, and I can do the distances between here and there, and most interesting things that I've thought were interesting in Hawaii. So it's kind of a travel book, but it's a murder mystery, a serial killer book, actually. I set the serial killer in paradise, and that sets up a nice juxtaposition. I don't want to do it at Disneyland, but I will do it in a state. The
fans of your book, which seems to be quite a variety because you write a variety of stuff, what are they looking for from you? They say, oh, it's a Robert W. Walker book. I'm looking for this. This is going to be that. What do you want to give them so they keep coming back?
Usually they figure out it's a young adult book, and I never heard a complaint about it. But I enjoy doing those books because I can get a little respite from the Instinct series. The biggest seller is my Instinct series, but that's only because they don't realize the Edge series is even better. The Edge series is more down to the street level cop stuff. My character is an American Indian who's gone off the reservation and he's become a detective for Houston Police Department. And he's a cool guy. You know? That guy Smits could play him in a movie. But sometimes I get a character and I think, oh, Dennehy.
Brian Dennehy?
Yeah, Brian Dennehy. It's perfect for the main character, Ransom, in City for Ransom. And I think Instinct, I haven't quite come up with an actress for her. But almost any really good actress can play her. Jimmy Smits for the Edge series. I had him in mind the entire time. So edgy. Nobody knows what he's going to do next.
Well, what do you want to do next? Do you continue on your next series? You start another series? What is it because you pump them out. You're pumping out 3 a year. I was looking at the release dates. So what is it you're going to do?
I really had a serious head injury. I can't tell you how bad it was. I was on a ventilator. I'm walking now when it came. So it'd be a lot easier for me to just continue one of my series. I started a new series called the Under series. Under the Dead Man's Hat, Under the Dead Lady's Corset. Very Edgar Allan Poe-ish. And then the third one I'm working on now, and I'd like to finish, is Under the Hair of the Dog. You know you're going to get a medical examiner doing an autopsy on a dog. Because the other two...
Yeah, that's a good title.
It's a new medical examiner series. She's a little younger and doesn't have as much experience. But she's a Chicago medical examiner, and she works with a guy that I did another series on, Dean Grant. He was the medical examiner for Chicago. So I brought him back. He's in the series. There's 2 ladies, medical examiners. They kind of help each other because Grant's a handful.
So you mentioned, and I see that you write short stories. What is the difference in your writing for the short story to make it into a novel or put those into a set? What's the difference for you in writing stuff from short to long?
I like shorts because it's just quick and easy, and I go by the rule of 1. Stick with one main character, one setting, one kind of mood you want to set, and everything comes back circular. One setting at the beginning. You're still at the setting at the beginning, you're setting at the end. Like a lady in a closet, and she's thinking of the various times that she should have known that this guy was bad news. But by the end of the story, she's found a big, long knitting needle. And when he opens the door, you know where he's locked her in. He's a bit abusive husband. She's decided she's not going to take it anymore. So she got the knitting needle, and the door opens, and that's all you need. You don't have to show the violence. I think violence isn't necessary very often. You can just show the conflict. Conflict is necessary. Violence is not necessary, especially in a short story. My good friend Joe Conrath, who's a writer, kind of taught me how to do that short story, come full circle. Because I was doing terrible short stories. My mind was not set to do short. My mind was set to do full-length novels. But Joe sat me down and did the 1-1-1 thing. One character, one setting, one time zone. That was the third one I was trying to think of. And it really helps you to do the short story.
I'd never heard that before. I'm writing that down. Circle
on the floor, on the wall. I teach creative writing, and I show the points. You know, it can be the whole story can be flashback, but it's got to be one main character, one setting, one time zone. So one is the secret. Number 1 is the secret. Yeah, works very well for almost any story I've done. The short story book I did, one short story book I did, I used the main character in each one of my novel series. It's set in a short story. That's called Party of 8, because there were 8 stories, eight main characters at that time. I've got like 10 series now. I think I got more series than Stephen King. Everybody's in Stephen King's shadow. His short stories are amazing. Robert Bloch's short stories. The guy who wrote Psycho, fantastic short story writer. Chekhov, great short story, the Russian short story writer. A short story, a really nice short story, beautiful. It's more like a diamond, whereas a novel is more like a string of pearls, chapter, chapter, chapter. I feel more comfortable with that. But I did a series of short stories called Darkness Chasing Light. So those are the two I have on Kindle. And I kind of got pretty good at short story. I enjoyed it after I started doing that process. And I like the surprise ending. I like to do surprise endings, like O. Henry. I kind of read a lot of O. Henry. I've got so many writers that I've learned from, stolen from, that have inspired me. I can't even list them all.
Who's number one?
Mark Twain. My spiritual advisor, fantastic writer. And the fact that he could write nonfiction and fiction got me realizing that I really wanted to write in various genres, categories. I didn't want to write in one category. My editors, when I was doing New York, they're all that didn't please them. They wanted me to stick with one series, one type of genre. They don't want you to mix it up.
If someone hasn't read one of your books yet, what one book or what series would you tell them to go to first in order to get the feel or what you want them to know about you?
Well, if they're really interested in realistic horror, like newspaper serial killers, I'd say Killer Instinct. But if they're interested in more like the Chicago or New York or Los Angeles stories, or more like police stories, I would say the first Edge book, Cutting Edge. I never liked that title, but they decided. The publisher at that point wanted all the books with the word Edge in them, so they started with Edge. Final Edge is my favorite in the series because it's based on my second door. The Killer is based on my second wife, which only lasted a year.
We should let that go, Al. Let's let that go. We're going to be digging in Robert's backyard.
But if they're interested in history, the Ransom book, City for Ransom, would be the first book. I'm really proud of that book because it really touches on history in a very adult way. It's not a young adult. I also did a book on the American Indians in the Civil War, and they lost more people. They lost more men during the Civil War in Indian Territory per capita than any state in the Union. People don't realize that. It's like the black people that have been in every American war. We don't give them enough pride and attention. That book is called The Red Path. That's a historical novel. I've done a couple of books with the American Indians. And, of course, the main character in the Edge books, he's an American Indian off the res. So if you're looking for sweet Disneyland stuff, the first book would be Daniel Webster Jackson and the Wrong Way Railway. That was my first book. I like the idea that I can write in 3 separate categories.
It's impressive. It really is.
So do you have a favorite character out of all the characters you've written? One character that stays with you all the time?
The character in all the Instinct books. But I also really like Ransom. He's really cool. But she's the one earning most of the money.
Good for her.
Quite a challenge to write from a female point of view for a man. Write from your opposite. If you're white, make your character black. If you're black, make your character white.
Do you feel like they can't? That's a question, though. Do you feel like they can't know that experience? That they're, you don't know the black experience. You don't know the American Indian experience. You're not a female. You don't know the female core character.
Imagine yourself a little kid in Africa, setting. Imagine the setting you've never been into, Mexico, and you're starving and you're begging on the street. So some of my students do very well with that. Some don't. My students, I've had students after 30 years contacting me on Facebook and found me, and they just want to say that you're the best English teacher I ever had. So I get a lot of satisfaction out of that. A couple of them are have published books. One of them doing quite well. Lee Shargell, he's making a lot more money than I am.
Right one together.
It's not all about money. It's about accomplishment and, feeling like you've done a good job.
Do you have a website or a place that you like people to come find you? And do you like getting comments from readers? Or how do people do that?
INK Walker at yahoo.com, and that's my website. And I do a blog on there too. And a lot of article information, nonfiction, which I'm also capable of. I'm kind of more on writing. Most of my blogs are on the art of writing.
Yeah, I've read several of them. They're very good. And thank you for those.
I consider writing an art form. If I wasn't a writer, I'd be an actor, because I really become the characters. I think writing is a challenge. You have to challenge yourself, and I love the challenge.
Well, this has been a great conversation, and we've enjoyed having you on. We'll have your website up on our website as well, so people can find you with one click. So thank you very much, Mr. Robert W. Walker.
George, thank you.
You've been listening to the House of Mystery radio show. To find out more about our guests, hosts, or shows, go to www.houseofmystery.com.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me?
Well, good night.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.
I'll be back.